Well, first of all, I want to thank Dr. Hanush for such a terrific lecture. I learned so much from that, and I'm really excited to share with you a little bit about our story. My name is Sue Sisley. I'm a physician from Arizona, and I practice internal medicine and psychiatry. And I'm also, I was a professor at the University of Arizona. I was at the College of Medicine there for almost 10 years, and I basically, served patients there, did telemedicine, and unfortunately I was at the forefront of some of the most controversial research at the university, and eventually was fired from that medical school after years of battling the administration there to try to get this research underway. This is part of why I've been fighting so hard to study marijuana, because the American Medical Association put out this statement about our ethical obligation as physicians. Says that, as doctors, we are required to not just obey the law, but to change the law, to work to reform laws that are not in the best interest of our patients. And I would argue that, criminalizing use of medical marijuana is a bad law and needs to be changed. And that's why I really applaud the folks who have organized these seminars in this country who are trying to teach people about the medical use of marijuana. I think their courage in trying to provide accurate information about marijuana is so important, and that's why I'm really honored to be here. Just so you know, I've never actually tried marijuana in any formulation. I'm not part of the marijuana industry. I just care about the science. I'm interested in the research side. And this is an example of the very dangerous, subversive work that we were trying to do at the university. This is I was the principal investigator on this study, looking at, it's an FDA-approved study, looking at whole plant marijuana for the treatment of PTSD. And here is exactly what we were trying to do, right? So we were looking at both the safety and the efficacy of whole plant marijuana, of these 4 different strains of smoked marijuana. And let me just go through these with you real quick, because I want you to see. So our government does provide a placebo of marijuana, right? So we can buy from our federal government marijuana where all the cannabinoids have been leached out. They get alcohol, the plant is alcohol washed, and none of the cannabinoids are left. So a 0% THC placebo is available. Then we also asked to look at high THC marijuana. The highest available from our U.S. federal government is 12% THC. So hardly resembles what is available on the street, but it's the best we can get from our government. So then we also asked for a high CBD strain. So the marijuana would have 12% cannabidiol and no other cannabinoids. And then the final one is a 12% CBD, 12% THC. So it's an equal ratio of cannabidiol and THC. Those are the 4 strains that we're proposing to study, and we hope to be underway this summer. And so here is what the study looks like. Basically, military veterans will be enrolled for about 12 weeks total. And there's these 3 stages. They're going to be given whole plant marijuana from the federal government, and they get to take it home with them. So they actually will be administering the marijuana in their homes and titrating, adjusting the dose to target the post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. And so after 3 weeks of home self-administration of the marijuana, they are cut off the study drug for 2 weeks straight. So they're not allowed to take any more marijuana for 2 weeks, and we will be monitoring them aggressively to see how they're responding to being cut off the drug, if their post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms end up relapsing during that time. Then after that, they get re-randomized into a new strain of marijuana. So let's say they were on high THC marijuana for the first 3 weeks. They may get they may get assigned to a new strain that is maybe high in CBD instead, and we'll see how they respond to that different strain. And then, of course, they get, again, cut off their study drug for 2 weeks straight, and then finally they enter stage 3, where they're allowed to get back all of their unused marijuana. So each week they are required to bring back any marijuana they don't use, and we weigh it to see how much they actually needed each day. They're allowed to take up to 2 grams of marijuana per day, of the dry, raw marijuana. I don't know if a lot of the veterans claim that they don't need 2 grams a day. Some of them use much less, some of them use more, so we'll see what they end up needing. And obviously there's a whole infrastructure around the study where the physicians are going to be contacting them regularly to evaluate how they're doing on the medicine. We're going to be administering this whole battery of tests. The main test, the most important one, is the CAP scale. So the clinician-administered PTSD scale is the most sensitive test for measuring severity of PTSD. It's the gold standard. So it's the one that the FDA uses to decide on adding new drugs for PTSD. And this is just I throw up this graph because it really speaks to the ways that marijuana has been hybridized. The plant has, changed, evolved so much over the years. You can see at one extreme, we have plants that are pure CBD only. We have plants that are pure THC with virtually no other cannabinoids. And then we have all these hybrids in the middle that have varying degrees of therapeutic benefit depending on, what symptoms you're trying to target. But to me, this really speaks to exactly why we fought so hard to study whole plant marijuana, why we're not interested or focused at all on trying to isolate cannabinoids in our study, because we have so many pharmaceutical companies that are already trying to do that, trying to isolate a specific cannabinoid and synthesize it into a pill form, and we don't want to do that. We want to look at the raw plant and understand the potential. And that's exactly what Deepak Chopra said here is so smart. He said isolating an active constituent from a plant, a single constituent, is an affront to nature, right? It's like taking the intelligence out of the plant and leaving all the wisdom behind. I think that's a brilliant statement about why the study of whole plant marijuana is so important. So I wanted to give you guys, to arm you with some ammunition when you start talking to the opponents of marijuana, who are constantly going to tell you that there's not enough research, right? We don't have enough studies on marijuana. I want you to explain to them why these arguments are so absurd, because first of all the speakers today are going to share with you examples of very important published studies that highlight the true medical benefit of marijuana. So there's hundreds and hundreds of published articles that already clearly define that marijuana has medical benefit. But unfortunately, many of these studies are kind of low-powered studies, case series. They're not the kind of randomized controlled trials that this study represents. So that's why we're fighting so hard to get this work underway. But this is an example of how marijuana research has been systematically impeded in the United States. There's a very, very profound effort from the government and many wealthy, powerful groups in the US who don't want to see this research ever get underway. And they are determined to thwart this work and suppress it at every turn. Here is a typical timeline of how long it takes marijuana research to happen in the US, and probably similar for other countries. So we submitted our study design to our FDA back in 2010. right? 5 years ago, we submitted it. The FDA are physician investigators, so they looked at the study with, you know, and welcomed the study. They were not the blockade. It's very important for you to know that the FDA is not opposing marijuana research. So they worked with us collaboratively to try to optimize the study design, to make it better. And then just a few months later, in April 2011, suddenly we had FDA approval. But here we are 5 years after our initial submission to the FDA, still unable to get this work underway, despite having FDA approval and hurdling all the various other government obstacles. So after we got FDA approval, there was a huge media frenzy, New York Times articles and all kinds of mainstream media outlets talking about, hey, look, we get to study marijuana in veterans with PTSD. Isn't this great? But nothing has gotten started yet. And I won't bore you with all the details of how this study has been suppressed, but I will just give you an example. At my university, which considers itself a Research One institution, right, that they value research, these guys continue to argue that doing marijuana research on a university campus is illegal. But what they're really saying is that they are worried that marijuana research will threaten their federal funding, right? That they get tons of, you know, they draw down so much federal money, and they know that since marijuana is federally illegal, that they're afraid that their funding will be threatened. So they choose to say it's illegal. They said, oh, well, you'll have to run a bill. You know, you'll have to run legislation through to prove to us that it is legal to do this work. So we did. We actually crafted a bill, SB 1443, that would confirm that it is legal to do this work on any university campus, and it passed. It took us a year to get this bill through the process, but it passed and was signed by the governor a year later. And then we went back to the university and we said, hey, we have FDA approval, we have a bill confirming it's legal, and then we went through the IRB process of the university. So the Institutional Review Board is a committee of lay people, lawyers, doctors, who look at all research on human subjects, right? And they decided that our study was very important, and they approved us to move forward. And so the university's own IRB committee approved the study back in 2012. And they said, yes, the university should embrace this work, and it is safe. And still, the university contended that this was illegal. So this is the president of the university who fired me, and she is, you know, adamantly opposed to, she didn't understand how they could possibly allow veterans to smoke marijuana on campus. That's what she was worried about. You know, the optics of how that would look to the media and to her donors. So I put this quote up there about, you know, that I talk to to people the same way, whether they're the garbage man or the university president, and that was what probably put me at odds with these folks, because I just told her very bluntly that, you know, if I were a scientist looking at the life cycle of the earthworm or some other esoteric subject, that I would have had lab space at the university within a month. But because we dared to study marijuana, we don't get any space, we don't get any hope of doing this work there. And so we created a political action committee called Americans for Scientific Freedom. This was also something the university was deeply concerned about, that I was becoming politically active, but I was a government employee. And I was only half-time, so I had plenty of hours each week to devote to political activism when I wasn't working for the university. So I felt that was my right, and I pursued this. We raised tons of money from the medical community to try to eliminate the barriers to marijuana research by raising money and giving checks to elected officials, hoping to persuade them that marijuana research is important. And then we continued to get tons of media coverage, and we highlighted the fact that there was this giant surplus in Arizona, just in our state alone. there's a $9 million surplus from the medical marijuana program. So just from selling cards to patients, these ID cards, and from collecting licensing fees from growers, we raised $9 million. And the medical community said, why is that money not being used to support research? You know, they don't have any other use for it. It's voter protected, so it can't be swept to, you know, to be used to build roads. It has to be used for something relevant to the program. So we argued for marijuana research. We said politics should never trump science. We had the military veterans, for the first time ever, I saw military veterans become politically active in Arizona. And we have about 500,000 military veterans living throughout our state who started to demand answers. And here are some of our opponents, right? This group takes a lecture, they call this lecture, Marijuana Harmless? Think Again, right? This is a group of people, basically it's all law enforcement. So it's prosecutors and police that go around with this lecture trying to brainwash elected officials about why marijuana is so toxic and has to be suppressed at every turn. So they take this around, they buy these elected officials lunch, and they teach them about how deeply dangerous marijuana is. These were our opponents in the legislature. And then suddenly the university, under all this media pressure, they suddenly agreed to give us a space. Look at this. They gave us a space full of asbestos in the floor and the ceilings, and this is where they proposed that we conduct this research. You know, this is it. And we said, oh, is anybody going to help us renovate this? And they said, no, here's your space. So you can see how much they value this research. And this is, you know, another opponent in the legislature who killed the bill that would have basically enabled this research to be funded. But the good news is that since I got fired, we've had worldwide media attention about the barriers to marijuana research. It's been extremely valuable. Millions of dollars in free publicity focused on our saga and trying to get this work underway. So the good news is, after I got fired, I got a partnership with Johns Hopkins University. We received a $2.2 million grant from the Colorado Health Department. It was like the best comeback story of 2014. And here's examples of other studies that the Colorado Health Department agreed to fund. So in addition to our grant, which was the largest, they are also looking at all of these different illnesses. And they've taken about $9 million and spread it out amongst all of these projects. So hopefully in the next 2 years, you're going to see the data from all of these projects, and you'll be able to learn, we'll start to understand more about how marijuana works for these various illnesses. But basically, continued front page news on all these different publications. This was what they uncovered. As the media continued to investigate this, they realized that one state senator, and not any senator, but the president of the Senate, decided that I was a problem, because these are legislators who take money from big pharmaceutical companies and from private prisons and from all the people who oppose marijuana. And so these few extremist legislators decided to get rid of me, and they created legislation that said that no university money will ever go to support marijuana research. This was an addendum, buried in page 20 of a bill that nobody would have seen. But we found that, and we exposed that, and suddenly, these legislators started gunning for us because they saw that we were a problem. This is really the concern, though, is that we have many elected officials who believe that marijuana research is just a strategy to promote legalization. They don't care about the science. They actually call it pseudoscience, fake sham science. They don't believe that this is real research. And so this is what we're up against here, that they believe that all science is just a political strategy to promote legalization. But the best thing that came out of getting fired was suddenly the epidemic of military veteran suicide became front page news. So more and more media outlets were reporting about 22 veterans a day killing themselves in our country. So in the US, we have more military veterans who die by suicide than die in active duty. It's unbelievable. We don't know how to treat post-traumatic stress disorder in the US. And the efforts to, you know, uncover new treatments, as you can see, get suppressed. So anyway, we were whisked all around to all these different, this is Dr. Sanjay Gupta from CNN, who's done such a good job. He adopted our project and has helped us bring, you know, shed light on all of the barriers to marijuana research. So we're very lucky to have all of these media outlets talking about the injustice of this. And you can see here this New York Times article, they spent months investigating my firing. They found out that this, you know, this legislator proudly admitted that he called the university and demanded that I be fired. And the university said, she will not be a problem moving forward. It's like the mafia, you know, we're gonna get rid of her. And they did. They got rid of me, and suddenly there was a vast outcry from the veteran community. All the military vets launched a petition on change.org. They got 110,000 signatures in the matter of a week or two. It was amazing, but still the university refused to reconsider, and we had great people like this. Andy Weil, you may know, is an expert in alternative medicine, and he wrote an open letter to the media condemning the university president for her negligent decision to suppress this research. So Andy Weil, what's great about this letter was Andy is a faculty member at the University of Arizona Medical School, where he chairs the Department of Integrative Medicine. So as a chairman, to get, you know, a letter from the chair of a really important department at the university was just pure gold, and it really helped us talk about this subject. But basically, at this point, we've been blackballed from all the universities. This is a headline in Denver where, you know, we can't. I'm unemployable now. I can't get a job with a public university because of that. I have chosen to continue our research in the private sector, and the good news is I've already gotten IRB approval from the private sector to move forward with our study. So we're proving that we don't need the universities. If the universities are too short-sighted and intellectually backwards to understand the value of this work, then we will move forward without them, and they will hopefully come to regret later the fact that they missed out on this opportunity. I wanted to just highlight a couple things. The DEA, you know, in the US, the Drug Enforcement Agency decides on the scheduling of controlled substances. It's very bizarre. You have law enforcement professionals who decide on whether a certain drug has medical benefit or not. Not medical people doing this, law enforcement. So they decide, you know, Schedule 1 here you can see defined as drugs having no medical value and high addiction potential, right? But many of you probably haven't seen the whole list of how these drugs are laid out. I wanted to show you, I think what all of us know and admit now is that it is a completely absurd situation that marijuana is lumped into Schedule 1 with all these much more toxic drugs. Doesn't make sense. But even more ridiculous is the fact that, you know, the DEA defines Schedule 4 as drugs having very minimal addiction potential. And you see drugs in Schedule 4 like Xanax, Ativan, you know, drugs that, if you know, the class of benzodiazepines are highly addictive. They have huge street value, you know, they're heavily abused by people. And yet the law enforcement says those are okay. Those have very little addiction potential. So it's a really ridiculous, this whole schedule needs to be redone by medical people who actually understand how this works. But here's the question for you guys is, why is it that if we are, you know, why is it that marijuana is harder to study than any other drug in Schedule 1 and it's the least toxic? Does it make sense that it's harder to study marijuana than it is to study LSD or heroin or any of these? It doesn't make sense. what it is, it's all about big government, right? This is classic federal government overreach, where they are trying to dictate what drugs we're allowed to study. And this is what makes sense, right? It's fine that if you want to study a controlled substance in the US, you go through these 3 agencies, right? That's fine, we don't argue with that. But what's ridiculous is that marijuana has to go through 2 additional reviews, a public health service review and the NIDA monopoly, and neither of these added layers of red tape have any timeline. So they can take 10 years to review your study and make it impossible to conduct. So I just put this side by side so you can see how ridiculous this is. If you want to study heroin, all you do is go through these 3 agencies. But if you want to study marijuana, you go through 5 layers of government red tape, and the 2 there in red have no timeline. So they can take as long as they want. And here is why we're objecting to this, to these redundant reviews, right? Because the Public Health Service review took us 3 years to get through that process. And ultimately, they approved our study without requiring any protocol changes, nothing. They just suppressed it. And during that time, 24,000 veterans in the US killed themselves during that. And could marijuana have helped these veterans? We don't know. That's why we want to study this, because we believe possibly marijuana could help curb this epidemic of veteran suicide, but it needs to be tested. And this is what's interesting. The FDA is on a 30-day timetable, so they're a joy to work with, right? Because they actually have to respond within 1 month. But these other agencies don't have any timeline. And finally, we ended up getting our Public Health Service approval only after Sanjay Gupta on CNN highlighted our study in their documentary, and they asked NIDA why they were stonewalling all this research, and suddenly a few days later we had our approval letter from Public Health Service. I'm not sure there's any coincidence. I think this is what, so why is it that I'm fully funded, I've hurdled all the federal government obstacles, but yet we're still not underway? Why is that? The NIDA monopoly, that's the term we call it. NIDA is the National Institute on Drug Abuse. They have a government-enforced monopoly on the only legal supply of marijuana for any of these FDA-approved research trials, right? So NIDA, this is the only Schedule I drug that has to deal with this situation. You know, when my sponsor, MAPS, does a study on MDMA, ecstasy, or LSD, they don't have to buy marijuana, they don't have to buy a study drug from NIDA. We buy our MDMA or our LSD from any research lab in the country. We don't have to go through this monopoly. Only marijuana is subject to this. So back in 1968, the DEA decided that there would only be one facility that will grow federally legal marijuana at the University of Mississippi. You've probably seen the pictures of their anemic, pathetic grow cultivation center. If NIDA doesn't like your study, all they have to do is refuse to sell you marijuana, and suddenly your study is impossible to do. You won't be allowed to do it. So, and yeah, as I said, this is the fact that they're not on any timetable. So NIDA can take 10 years. Right now, just so you know, we've been waiting 14 months for marijuana, right? So we got our final approval from Public Health Service back in March of last year, and now we're going on 14 months that the federal government has not, NIDA, has not been able to figure out how to grow the marijuana that we need for our study. So any other expert grower in our country, or here in Slovenia or Czech or anywhere, could have had marijuana for us grown to spec within 3 months. But NIDA cannot figure out how to do this. So why are we trying to study this? The bottom line is that there are millions of people suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder worldwide, and we are trying to uncover new treatments We've got 25%, you know, a quarter of our soldiers coming back from service have PTSD, and more media outlets are talking about the fact that the drugs that we have don't work. You know, they're either have tons of side effects or they're just not effective. And so here's, if you guys have heard this term, the combat cocktail. This is what the veterans call what they get put on when they come back from service. They're plagued with all these medical ailments, including PTSD maybe. They get put on one prescription after another until suddenly they're on, you know, 10, 15 different prescriptions. That's what they call the combat cocktail. They dread it. They dread being stuck on all these meds that have all these drug interactions and they're causing all these side effects. So the veterans end up feeling like zombies. They're almost completely non-functional. All they want to do is reintegrate into their family, and they can't because they're just worthless on all these meds. So this is how I became interested in this research, because I kept hearing one report after another from military veterans who said that they were getting benefit from this. And you know, as a physician, I'm skeptical, right? I listen to the patients, I hear their stories, but I don't believe anything until I see, you know, randomized controlled trials looking at a certain subject. But this is what the veterans were telling me, that they were benefiting from this plant more on these different target symptoms. They were benefiting much more from the plant than any medicine I could give them. And so eventually I finally started to listen in a way, you know, open my mind to the fact that this plant was working, and these veterans were not killing themselves. And I said, you know, we need to study this. I believe these vets when they tell me that they are getting better, that this, none of them were arguing they were cured. I want you to know. Nobody was saying it fixed their PTSD, but it seemed to be effective symptom control, right? And the problem in psychiatry is that we give patients a different pill for each target symptom, right? So they come in and they say they've got anxiety, they get put on a med for anxiety, they come back next month and they've got sleep problems and we put them on another med for sleep, and you can see how quickly that snowballs, and suddenly they end up on tons of different meds. None of them are really working that well. And here is a great illustration, right? One of our veterans painted this, and I just thought this depicts better than anything else I've seen what our military veterans are dealing with, right? They're drowning in pill bottles and pills, and they barely even can, you know, lift their head up. They're so, you know, they're so non-functional. And suddenly they discover marijuana, and it saves their life. That's what they keep reporting. How can we ignore this mountain of anecdotal evidence? I think we have a duty to these veterans to study this. This is why the situation with PTSD is so sad, because these are the only two medicines on the market right now in the US that treat PTSD. These are the only two meds that have an official FDA indication. Paxil and Zoloft. If any of you know anything about these meds, you know that they cause tons of weight gain and sexual problems. So all these vets want to do is come back to their community and be normal, and they end up, we make them fat, we make them impotent. It's really tragic. And here is something also that I found compelling at that time was in the US we now have about 35 medical marijuana states, right? So there are 35 states that have some form of medical marijuana protection on the books. But this study came out just last year and said that in those states that have medical marijuana law, and at that time there was only 23 that actually had official law, it said that those states with medical marijuana laws had a lower incidence of prescription overdose death. That's so important, and I hope you guys use that article in your own work here in this country as you advocate for sane medical marijuana policy changes, that you show them, look at what happens when humans are allowed to access a plant and not forced to just function on standard prescription drugs, that there's a potential that there will be less overdose. And this is just, I just thought this was classic, because this is what we deal with, right? Patient comes in and they say, hey, can you get me some medical marijuana for my pain? And the doctor says, no, we're against this. We don't believe we believe that marijuana is too toxic to give you. But I'll prescribe you some OxyContin instead, right? So that's what, you look at the veterans, they're happy. The Veterans Administration hospitals are delighted to give these veterans 300 milligrams of OxyContin a day, these pain pills, but they won't dare give them a plant that has potential for much more benefit. I want to just review real quick. This is why, PTSD, this really speaks to the problem. Normally, we pride ourselves on having good memory. We really want to remember everything. But the truth is, when you've had trauma, forgetting is an essential part of survival, right? You have to be able to forget in order to continue functioning. And you can see back in, prehistoric times, we had so many instances where, if you couldn't forget a traumatic situation like this, you're being chased by some prehistoric animal, then you're not going to be able to deal with the next trauma in your life. So it's really important. So that's why our study is so essential, because it's the first and only randomized controlled trial in the world looking at whole plant marijuana for PTSD. So it's crucial that this study get underway, and a lot of people are depending on us to get this data collected. So I won't bore you with I think the big problem we have is that the grower for our federal government has no track record of even growing the marijuana that's rich in CBD, and that's what's been causing all the delays here. This is the head of the facility for the government, Dr. El Soli, who Lumir is good buddies with. This guy is a legit scientist, but he is a real problem to deal with when you dare to say you want to study the effectiveness of marijuana. This is what you come up against. This guy has his hand in a barrel of ground up marijuana. That's how they deal with research in the US. They take the entire plant from root to tip and they throw it in a grinder and they roll it up into these cigarettes that then get shipped out to scientists all over the country. So I don't want to give you the impression there's no marijuana research happening in the US. There's tons of marijuana research looking at harmful side effects of marijuana or addiction potential of marijuana, all sponsored by the government, all well endowed with as much marijuana study drug as they want, But what happens is when you dump out the contents of these cigarettes, which many of our colleagues have done, you'll see what this marijuana really is, right? This is what we get to study the effectiveness of marijuana, is stems, sticks, leaves, very little of the flowering plant material that we know is actually, the most beneficial. So, a lot of people would argue that this sabotages a study from the beginning, right? That if you're stuck with this is the only legal supply that we have. So, very frustrating. And this is just more, many of the speakers today are going to talk to you about the history of how marijuana has come. But look at, all these native healers utilizing, teaching future generations about how marijuana could be effective. And we, all kinds of, I work with the Native American tribes in Arizona, and we regularly work with the traditional medicine men who actively use, who utilize medically active plants to treat their tribe members. And this was just something that I was impressed by, that, that when you look at a plant, the lifeblood of a plant is chlorophyll. The lifeblood of humans is hemoglobin, right? We need hemoglobin to transport oxygen. Same thing with the plant. They use, but look at how similar the molecules are and how much plants and humans end up resembling each other and using a similar system to preserve life. And here is, as Mumir said, You know, this is our hero who helped us uncover. This is what finally persuaded me when I saw the incredible discoveries in the 90s, which, as many of your speakers are going to talk to you about, you know, we never got to learn this in medical school. Not once did we ever discuss the endocannabinoid system. And suddenly I learned later that this is, you know, a discovery from the 90s, and nobody's talking about it. I mean, nobody in mainstream, you know, traditional medical school curriculum. We don't get exposed to this, but this is a very sensible explanation about, you know, that this really has a biological basis. This isn't just, you know, stoners that are drug seeking. There's real science. There's real, you know, as Lumir so elegantly discussed, the lock and key theory with these different cannabinoids, and the fact that we have endocannabinoids, we've got phytocannabinoids, and we've got synthetic cannabinoids, and all of them use this same lock and key mechanism to work. It's finally, you know, it was such an illuminating experience to learn about this system. So let's see, and I'll let many other folks are going to talk about this, so I won't go into this. But I did want to mention, for those of you who are aware of acupuncture, how the map of the human body and how chi, you know, flows, the energy flows through the body. What I learned from, you know, from talking to people who are experts in acupuncture is they talk about how the energy flow ends up in the abdomen. In the same way, the cannabinoid receptors, you know, if you look at the way CB2 receptors are concentrated in the human body, this diagram here shows that, again, the abdomen tends to concentrate CB2 receptors, and similar to the target area of acupuncture, chi. And, you know, we've had so many, you're going to hear a lot about how complex the plant is, but this is just one other diagram that genes of these plants can hopefully be brought back to the forefront so that we can uncover new strains, new hybrids of marijuana. And this is definitely not an endorsement for GW. I actually put this up to remind myself that GW Pharmaceuticals is one of the biggest opponents of whole plant marijuana research. So even though they claim to be, you know, the purveyors of marijuana research, the truth is that they actively oppose ours. They hire lobbyists to go around and make sure that research like ours never sees the light of day. And that's very problematic. So even though as physicians, we want consistent medicine, right? We always are looking for a way to how do we give people the exact same medicine and the exact same dose, and that's what GW has created for us. It's true. They've created a method to do that. But I think that we're missing with this the beauty of this plant, the fact that patients with the whole plant marijuana are empowered to deal with the plant in their own way. You can adjust the dose each day to figure out what your needs are. You don't have to follow a specific dosing regimen in a product insert. And that's why I bring this up too, because you're going to see all these devices coming out of the woodwork now, you know, showing you, hey, we can give you consistent dosing. This here, a meter dose inhaler that delivers an exact dose each time. Yeah, it's true. Now, it's slowly, as prohibition becomes lifted in different countries, you know, as legalization becomes a reality, we're going to see more and more innovations like this. And I'm not endorsing this at all. I think that really what the beauty of the plant is we don't really need devices like this. In the end, patients can teach themselves and can teach each other how to use the plant best in the most optimal way to manage their own symptoms. So that's all I have. I'm gonna turn it because we're not taking Q&A, are we? I don't think we're gonna. No. So I'll let the next speaker come. But thank you all very much. I appreciate it.